Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ever episode of Mailbag Monday. If you follow me on Twitter, you probably know what this is by now. If you don't follow me on Twitter, then I'll do a little explanation. So, this is a new series I'm doing on my YouTube channel where I will collect JMU football related questions throughout the entire week. And then every single Monday, a new video will come out of me breaking down every single question, giving my analysis on it. And this is the first ever episode. So I'm really excited to get into it. And we have two questions that I want to break down at the start. These questions kind of go together. So we first have Josh Wolliver. What's a realistic expectation for JMU's program next season coming off a big bowl bound season last year? And then we have Coach Clark. Sunbelt schedule due to be released this week. This was before the schedule was released, but now we do officially have the schedule out. So we said Sunbelt schedule due to be released this week. Curious about your take on the best and worst case scenarios on this season. I really appreciate the questions. And in terms of what I think the best case is, probably a bowl game. And I think that some people have it in their mind that this team could potentially make a run for the college football playoffs. And I just don't necessarily see that. I think this team would have to go nearly undefeated if they want even a chance at the college football playoffs. They might actually have to go undefeated, and I don't see that happening. They play two really tough teams, two really big teams. They play Washington State and then they play Louisville. We actually knew about both of these games before the schedule was fully released, but these are the two biggest teams that JMU will have to face this season. And truth be told, I think they have a chance against them. I don't think it's a great chance that they win both of those games, obviously, and winning these games would bring a lot of credibility to JMU because if they win these games, then teams are going to look at them and say, okay, this is a team that plays some not as good competition. But when they had the chance to go against these really solid teams, they did show out. And, that would obviously, as I mentioned, give JMU some extra credibility. I'm not sure if they are going to win both of these games. And then you have to look at some in conference Sun Belt stuff, some competitions against other Sun Belt teams, because those can also give JMU a few problems. Specifically, Marshall. Of course, Marshall is losing Mike Green to the NFL draft. Green led all of NCAA last season with the most sacks, but Marshall was still the best team in the Sun Belt, and JMU did lose to Marshall. And then another team I want to talk about, Appalachian State. This team has been a problem for JMU for quite some time now. Going back to College Game Day in 2023, that's where JMU took their first loss of the season, and then they lost to Appalachian State again this past season. I had Gannon Weathersby on the podcast recently. He's a JMU linebacker, and I just asked him if there's any team goals that he had for this upcoming season. And one thing that he said that I thought was pretty interesting, obviously, make a bowl game, get as far as they can. But the other thing he said was beat Appalachian State. And that just shows you that the players really care as well. They really want to beat Appalachian State too. But where I'm getting at, do I think they can? Absolutely. But those are four teams that I just named: Louisville, Appalachian State, Marshall, and Washington State. And I'm not sure JMU can have a perfect record, not lose a single game all season when you have to play those four teams. There's obviously some other in conference teams that could give them some struggles. So that's what I think the best they could do is bowl game appearance. And if you're asking for a record, I would say probably the best they could do is around 11-2. Maybe you see 12-1, but I highly doubt that. I think anywhere from 11-2 to maybe 8-5 is what you could expect from them this season. I'd obviously hope it's closer to 11-2, but I also think 8-5 could be very much a possibility. And then what's the worst this team could do? Probably a bowl game appearance. And I know that isn't the most interesting answer that, the best they can do is a bowl game appearance, the worst they can do is a bowl game appearance. But this is a very solid roster. They're losing a lot of guys compared to last season. They're losing Amarian Dollison, Taylor Thompson, Jacob Dobbs, Terrence Spence. They are losing a lot of guys on this roster. Kyrie Mance as well, who declared for the 2025 NFL draft. Even Ryan Hansen, the punter. When you lose this many pieces, I don't think, there's really a chance that you can go 12 and 2 or 12 and 1, sorry. But I also think they have a solid enough roster to the point where this is a team that will be contending to make a bowl game. And then obviously, when you have good coaches, when you have Bob Chesney, I really like Colin Hitchler as the new defensive coordinator. I kind of broke that down on my interview with Jack Fitzpatrick. You can go check that out. But I really like that move. And then Dean Kennedy, obviously. I think he had an interview with the Jaguars for a potential role in their coaching staff. I don't think he's going to take that role, but this is a very solid coaching staff. And when you have this coaching staff and then you have at least a solid roster, I'm not going to say it's as good as they were last year or the year before that, but you have at least a solid roster to go with this really good coaching staff. This team's at least going to make a bowl game, and they don't play in the toughest conference, obviously, of any team. So that's what I think the lowest you could set your expectations to, and then bowl game is also the highest you could set your expectations to. Again, I wouldn't count on making the college football playoffs. Now, moving over to the next question, we have Daniel Merriman, who's been supporting the channel for a while now. I really appreciate that. Who do you think in the linebacker room will step up next year? And a name that I mentioned, Jacob Dobbs, who's obviously declaring for the 2025 NFL draft. I think that's kind of why he asked this question. We're losing Jacob Dobbs. Dobbs was one of the premier defenders on this JMU team last season. And I think one of the main names is probably Trent Hendrick. Hendrick last season, 54 total tackles, 3 sacks, and a forced fumble. And then you also have Gannon Weathersby, who I talked about a little bit earlier. In 2024, Weathersby had 20 tackles, 1.5 sacks, and 2 forced fumbles. If you want that in comparison to Jacob Dobbs, Dobbs last year, 70 total tackles, 3 sacks, 3 forced fumbles, or 3 fumble recoveries, my apologies. But when you look at Weathersby and Hendrick, you look at two guys who have shown a lot of potential that they can be stars in the future. I just don't think they've gotten enough playing time. And that's not to say they haven't gotten a good amount of playing time, especially Trent Hendrick. He has gotten some good linebacker 2 minutes behind Jacob Dobbs last season. But now these two can really take over. These are the two guys that JMU trusts the most right now. Gannon Weathersby has spent his first 3 seasons with JMU. He's watched a lot of new guys come in. He's always been here, though. And then Trent Hendrick has also been with JMU for quite some time now. I think these guys are just going to take really big jumps this upcoming season. You have JT Kwame Yao, who came from Shepherd, I believe, in the transfer portal. He's a senior. I don't know if he's going to get quite as much playing time this year. I'd expect him to get some minutes here and there, but if they're consistently going to go to two guys, it's definitely going to be Hendrick and Weathersby. Those are the two main guys to keep an eye out for. Weathersby, by the way, is just a junior, so he'll be a big name to keep in mind for next season as well. But there's no doubt losing Jacob Dobbs is going to hurt this team. Luckily, they have some good linebacker depth, and they've had some good linebacker depth for a while now. I'm glad that we're going to be able to see these two guys really take a big step. They're going to look great. I know they will this season. But yeah, I think in terms of a diamond in the rough player, probably Gannon Weathersby. And I only say that because Trent Hendrick, named his stats earlier. He actually did get a solid amount of playing time last year. He was on the field a lot but Gannon Weathersby didn't nearly see the field as much. So I think this is going to be a big upgrade for him this season, and I'm really excited to see how they both look. But yeah, the linebacker room really isn't anything to worry about. This should be a very solid area in JMU's defense. Now, moving over to the next question, Jason H., what position did JMU do the best job at filling through the transfer portal this offseason? So this is an easy one for me. It has to be wide receiver. JMU actually lost a few wide receivers after last season. Amarian Dollison, who graduated, and then Cam Ross, who left for Virginia. And Cam Ross wasn't amazing last season. He had over 100 less receiving yards than he did with UConn the previous year, and he also led the team in drops, yet he was still one of Alonzo Barnett's main targets, so I think that is obviously an area that JMU would like to fill. It almost felt like they were getting a fresh start at the wide receiver position. They lost two of their main wide receivers. They just wanted to really reload the position. They obviously still have Ymir Knight, who might be the best wide receiver on this team. We'll have to see. I think especially if Alonzo Barnett is the starter, he will be. I don't think that's going to be the case. That could be a whole nother conversation. But based on what I've heard, what I've seen, the moves I've seen JMU make, I wouldn't assume that Barnett is going to be the starter next season. He obviously dealt with that non-contact injury he suffered on the last offensive play against Marshall on, I believe, it was either October or November 30th. I believe November 30th, but he missed the bowl game because of that, and we don't really have any updates. We don't have any information towards how his recovery process is going, which probably isn't a great thing when you look at it that way. But I wouldn't expect Barnett to emerge as a starter at the beginning of next season. But let's get into some guys that JMU brought in at the wide receiver position. One of those guys is Nick DeGennaro. DeGennaro had just over 2,000 receiving yards during his 3 seasons with Richmond. He played only 9 games. Last season, I believe he got around 550 receiving yards. The year before that, though, in 2023, when he played a full 13 games, DeGennaro had 72 receptions for 912 receiving yards and 11 touchdowns. JMU also added another Richmond receiver. I don't know if I mentioned DeGennaro was from Richmond, but they added another Richmond receiver, Landon Ellis. Landon Ellis caught 50 passes last season for 588 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns. Now, I was saying that I don't think Barnett's going to be the starter. If you ask me right now who I think could be the starter, you obviously have to consider Matthew Sluka, but I'd probably go with Camden Coleman. And the reason I say this is because Camden Coleman played at Richmond. He was the quarterback for both Landon Ellis and Nick DeGennaro. And I just feel like and they're going to bring in both of these wide receivers, it would just make sense that they play Coleman with two of his top wideouts. There has to be some connection to them bringing in all three of these guys. I'd assume they're playing together. Of course, I don't know that to be a fact, but I have a good feeling that Camden Coleman might be the starter if they did bring in two of his main receivers from Richmond. So those are two guys to really keep an eye out for. It could be two guys that get a lot of minutes, get a lot of playing time, and should step in and make an immediate impact with the Dukes. And then another player another key pickup was Jalen Sanchez from Villanova. Villanova is obviously an FCS school, but in Sanchez's last 2 seasons, he caught a combined 67 passes for 1,253 receiving yards and 9 touchdowns. I don't know too much about Sanchez. As I mentioned, he plays in the FCS. You could look at that how you want to look at that, but when it comes to general statistics, he was very productive last season with the Wildcats, and the season before that as well. He was actually slightly more productive in 2023, like DeGennaro, than he was in 2024. But JMU brought in a lot of very solid wide receiver pieces. So based off the guys I already mentioned, you have Ymir Knight, you have Jalen Sanchez, you have Landon Ellis, and Nick DeGennaro. Those are four really, really solid options. Now it gets to the point where this wide receiver room might actually be getting a little crowded, which is definitely the case. But in terms of just focusing on the question, what position did JMU do the best um, at acquiring through the transfer portal? It's definitely the wide receiver position, as I mentioned, after losing two of their main wide receivers from last season. Now, there's one other guy who I want to focus on who isn't nearly talked about as much, and that is Zeron Collins from Tusculum. I had no clue what Tusculum was, where Tusculum was before I knew the name Zeron Collins, and he didn't really do too much there last season during his redshirt sophomore season, which was last year. He had 10 receptions, 228 receiving yards, averaging just under 23 yards per reception. Now, what really interests me about Zeron Collins is two things. Number one, he has 3 years of eligibility remaining. He was a redshirt sophomore, I believe, last season. So he still has, I don't know if it's 3, it might be 2, but he definitely has, yeah, he does have 3 years of eligibility remaining. So he could I don't think he's gonna do very much this season. Obviously, I mentioned how crowded this wide receiver core is, but he has a lot of potential. Eventually, you come back to me in 2 years, he'll probably maybe be the top receiver on this team, probably be at least one of the most productive receivers, one of the most utilized receivers on this squad. And then I think he kind of brings in similarities to a guy like Amarian Dollison, which is why I am such a big fan of Zeron Collins. He's very fast. He's a massive deep ball threat. And I just feel like he's going to play similar with how we saw Dollison play last season. We obviously saw Dollison, I think it was a 69-yard touchdown against UNC when JMU scored 70 points. That's the kind of stuff you could see from Zeron Collins. He's extremely similar to Amarian Dollison, and I think JMU got him for those two reasons. One, because he could kind of fill that role and become a Dollison in a few years for them. And, he has a lot of time to improve. He's sitting behind a lot of really talented wide receivers on the roster. So he has all the assets he needs to become an extremely successful wide receiver in a few years. And I think that he will eventually become one, even if it's not this year, which I wouldn't expect him to get really any playing time this year, maybe a few plays here and there, but I'm really excited to see what he can do throughout the remainder of his college career. So that's more looking forward. The other guys are looking at this season, the impact they're going to make this year. Are they going to help JMU potentially make a bowl game this year? And absolutely, I really love what they did at the wide receiver position, going after all of those guys. Now, moving over to the final question of the day from Ian Harper. How is JMU going to adapt to losing both Terrence Spence and Eric O'Neal? And losing Eric O'Neal to Rutgers is obviously going to be a big blow for the Dukes. O'Neal had the fifth most sacks of any team in the Sun Belt, or not the Sun, in all of college football last season. I believe he had 13 total sacks on the year. So he was obviously a beast. Now, I think JMU got defensive end Xavier Holmes through the transfer portal from Maine, and I think Holmes is going to be the main guy. No pun intended. I think he's going to be the main guy in terms of filling that gap of Eric O'Neal. And with Maine in 2024, Holmes logged 72 total tackles, 12 and a half tackles for loss, 6 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries, and an interception. He picked JMU over schools such as UMass and FAU. He's If you look at one guy who JMU acquired through the transfer portal, who's going to make an instant impact for the Dukes in 2025, look no further than Xavier Holmes. He's going to be immediately involved in this defense, immediately be one of the best players on this entire defense. And I think I also had Holmes on the podcast, and a few things I talked about, what do you pride yourself on when it comes to your play style, your game? And one of the main things he continued to bring up, he's very quick, he's very explosive. All he wants to do is get to the cornerback. That's the exact mindset you would hear from a guy like Eric O'Neill. Um, I think that I think JMU knew what they were doing when they brought in Holmes. JMU obviously likes Holmes as a player, but I think they really brought him in to make up for losing Eric O'Neill, fill that role, fill that gap. That's what you're going to get from Xavier Holmes this upcoming season. And then you also have Kels Bush. And Kels Bush is a very interesting guy to keep an eye out for. He redshirted his first season at LSU before transferring to Louisiana Tech. He had the lowest PFF grade of any defensive player on Louisiana Tech last season. He's very big though. He's 6'3", 309 pounds. He's extremely unproven. In his 2 seasons with Louisiana Tech, he had just 12 combined tackles. And the thing that kind of concerns me. 12 tackles is not a lot. I understand if you want to take a chance on a guy who had 12 tackles and didn't get much playing time on a Georgia or a Texas or a Michigan. But Louisiana Tech's a 5-8 school. That's what they were last season. They're not a big school. They're not a great school. So the fact that you only get 12 tackles on a very average to below average school is a bit concerning. He didn't get a sack, no forced fumbles, no fumble recoveries. I'm not really sure what JMU's mindset was like when they got Kels Bush, what role they expect him to play. And I am looking forward to seeing how he does. I think he has a lot of potential. Again, he's just unproven. We haven't seen very much from him. And he won't be a starter. He's going to be playing behind some other guys, and I believe he has 2 years of eligibility remaining. So next year, maybe we see a little more from him. It's just hard to imagine he sees much playing time, sees the field too much this season. But we'll have to keep an eye out for him. And then another guy I want to talk about is Aiden Gobera. He's kind of similar to Kels Bush in a way, I guess. He's an extremely high upside transfer portal addition. Gobera was a 4-star recruit coming out of high school and was the 180th ranked player in the nation, according to 24/7 Sports. He didn't get any playing time last season with Notre Dame due to an ACL injury, but he has 3 years of eligibility remaining. He'll most likely be a backup this season, but I think he could obviously take those steps later in his college career. Now, there's a little bit different between Gobera and Kels Bush. I said that there's some similarities. There's also some differences, obviously. Kels Bush, we've seen a little bit from. We've seen him on the field a little bit this last season. I think he played around 12, 13 games maybe with Louisiana Tech. I'm talking about Kels Bush, obviously. And then Aiden Gobera hasn't played at all. We haven't seen a single college snap from him. But I think also coming out of high school, they both went to very big schools, Notre Dame and LSU. But I think when you just look at overall where these guys are ranked, Gobera has more upside when you want to look at it that way. Again, 180th ranked player in the nation. I know he was really, really highly ranked out of the state of Virginia, maybe like 5 to 7 in that range. I know I saw that somewhere. I just don't have the stat on me right now, so don't quote me on that. Um, but yeah, he was an elite prospect coming out of high school, and definitely JMU is definitely taking a chance on him. We don't know. He could not really do anything during his time with the Dukes. Maybe he's just not as good as we're expecting him to be. But when you're not really giving up anything. This is a very low risk, high reward situation when you're acquiring someone who was one of the better players in the nation during his senior season in high school. So I do like this pickup, and I think there is a lot of potential, the chance for Gobera to emerge as one of JMU's best defenders. Again, 3 years of eligibility, just like Saron Collins. So if he sticks around, he could become the real deal. We'll have to wait and find out. Now, I think JMU did a good job at adding defensive depth after losing Eric O'Neal. They struggled a little more to fill the role of Terrence Spence, in my opinion. Last season, Spence caught 5 interceptions, which was a team best. That was unfortunately his last season of eligibility. And the main cornerback that JMU picked up was Chance Harley. He was added this through the portal this offseason. And, Harley spent 1 season at Villanova. That's where he spent his first college season. And then he spent 3 seasons with Maryland as a redshirt junior. Last season, he racked up 16 tackles. He is now a senior. And this is another guy. I sound like a broken record, but this is another guy who was recruited to a really big school in Maryland, and he didn't play very much, and JMU is sort of taking a chance on him. This is the third player in a row that kind of fits in that same, requirement. I guess not requirement, but they're all in the same boat right now, and they might do absolutely nothing. We haven't seen enough from them to really know what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, or we might have found a diamond in the rough. And these players are really, really solid, though. Some other cornerbacks, um, I'd expect Chauncey Logan to probably be the starter next season alongside Chance Harley. This quarterback room is definitely JMU's biggest defensive hole entering the 2025 season. I think they did a good job filling linebacker, defensive line, even safety. They did a good job at filling. They obviously got Curtis Harris Lopez from Holy Cross. But this is a bit of a struggle at cornerback. I don't love the cornerbacks that they acquired. And I just don't know if there's enough cornerback depth necessarily. There's no one on this team that's returning that we've seen, I guess, other than Chauncey Logan. But there's not many guys that I've seen that really have that breakout potential, that superstar potential, as a cornerback on this team. And then JMU's secondary was very solid last season. They led the Sun Belt in interceptions. They had, I believe, the best defensive passing efficiency, allowed the fourth fewest yards per game of any team, passing yards per game of any team in the Sun Belt. So they weren't a bad defense. You obviously have the new coordinator stepping in, Colin Hitchler. And Colin Hitchler actually specializes in the secondary. He was a defensive backs coach at Alabama. So maybe that brings a little bit of an advantage to the cornerback room. But at the end of the day, I see this being a slight decline in terms of the cornerback room. I just don't know if it doesn't feel completely filled out. It doesn't feel like this is the best group of quarterbacks that JMU has obviously ever had. Terrence Spence was a game changer. And there's not really an X factor, if that makes sense. There's not anyone that can be a game changing player. It's a few solid players. I'm not sure it's enough to get the job done. Maybe JMU's not as good against the passing game this season. The rest of the defense is very solid. The rest of the offense is very solid. That's one thing I would like to monitor, though, throughout the rest of the season, kind of see how they're doing. Maybe they could surprise me. Maybe they could do really good. It's kind of hard to say now. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. But, you can only say so much before the actual season starts. We're going to have to see how they perform. Chance Harley might be the best cornerback on this team, maybe the best cornerback in the Sun Belt. And we don't know right now, or at least I don't know right now. I don't think many fans would know right now. But we'll have to wait and see. We'll have to wait and see on Harley. We'll have to wait and see on Bush. We'll have to wait and see on Gobera. Collins, I guess, or on Collins. Those are all guys that we're going to have to wait and see on and just kind of see what the future holds. Not really what the future holds, I guess, because um, Harley's a senior, but we'll just see what he can do because, again, we haven't seen very much of him. And I think there's a lot of potential there for him to be a breakout this season. And I'm looking forward to watching him on the field. With that being said, we're going to have to wrap things up here for the first ever episode of Mailbag Monday. If you made it up to this point, I really appreciate you watching. If you have a question For the next episode of Mailbag Monday, if you follow me on Twitter, you can just drop a comment and I'll see it that way. If you don't have Twitter, you don't follow me on Twitter, you can just leave a comment in the comment section of this video and I'll be sure to get to that question in the next episode. With that being said, I'm your host, Matthew Heiserman. This is the first ever episode of Mailbag Monday. Today's date is March 3rd, 2025. And as always, we will see you next time.